extremophiles, extreme meaning extreme, phile meaning loving. So these are organisms that love extreme conditions, right? And so I love studying extremophiles, specifically the ones that survive in really cold places and have really neat adaptations to the cold. I am not one of those things. I am cold right now. It's San Diego and I'm freezing. Life has a few key features to it, first of which is metabolism, right? So all life has a way of getting energy and making compounds to survive. Second, all life grows and develops, right? Life also finds a way to replicate, and it does so via storing information, right? So life has to have a way to store information via DNA. Life also responds and adapts to environments, and some of these environments approach the near limits of life, right? So the place I study is one of those places, the Dry Valleys. It's a place in Antarctica that is the most Martian-like place on Earth. A Martian analog is a place on Earth that is a lot like Mars, right? So the Dry Valleys fit all these characteristics of Mars. They're extremely cold places, they're very dry, light is fluctuating heavily between a lot of darkness and a lot of light, right? So there are plenty of places on Earth that have these conditions that approach the near limits of life that we go to study, right? And places that resemble a lot of other planetary bodies that are on Earth. One of the first polar explorers, Robert Falcon Scott, he was with the British Antarctic Survey, and he goes into the Dry Valleys and he's walking along and he writes in his journal, the Dry Valleys is a valley of the dead, which means he just thought that there was nothing alive, right? He saw nothing living there. And so a lot of places on Earth have been considered kind of dead zones, right? So not only in Antarctica, right? Antarctica was always thought as, you know, too cold for life, right? The deep sea was always thought as there's no life because there's no light, right? So a lot of these kind of early notions about where life can exist and how life can exist have been very rapidly with science proven to be, you know, incorrect. You know, there's tons of life in Antarctica that can exist in the cold. There's tons of life in the deep sea. So my questions going in to the Dry Valleys were, you know, what lives there? What is it doing? And how is it surviving in these really inhospitable conditions and places, right? And so, what science has kind of uncovered over the past, you know, not very old, about 25 years, you know, with research is, you know, so the Dry Valleys again are this Martian analog for only 4 to 6 weeks over the austral summer, which just means Antarctic summer. Streams go and rehydrate, so glaciers start to melt and then you get these really temporary little streams of water. And during that time, 4 to 6 weeks, you have these brilliantly colored cyanobacteria mats that pop up, right? It's just like Valley of the Dead, 4 to 6 weeks, teeming with life. So we go there over these 4 to 6 weeks and we look at all these really brilliant, beautifully colored cyanobacteria mats, and we find just quite a bit of life. It's still limited, but much more life than you know anyone thought could live on this Martian analog, right? So what are we finding there? We find diatoms, bacteria. We even find little micro animals. So nematodes, these little micro worms, right? We find tardigrades. A lot of people have heard of tardigrades. They're also known as water bears, right? They're these cute little, almost micro bears. They're very, very cute in terms of, you know, microbes. What else? We find rotifers, and you know, there's a whole little microbial world that develops in these microbial mats for, again, only 4 to 6 weeks, and then they go back to this dehydrated, almost invisible, you know, landscape, right? So, you know, what allows these organisms to survive, you know, in this kind of rapid, opportunistic little influx of water, right? Survive in these streams for about 4 to 6 weeks, right? And you have, you know, a fairly constant stream for these 4 to 6 weeks, but temperature fluctuations are so strong that you can have a day of, you know, a freeze over, right? So these organisms are still going through a lot of freeze thaw events, right? So one really cool adaptation we found for these organisms is ice binding proteins, and these proteins are a lot like they sound. They bind to ice, right? And what does that do for these organisms? Ice is really tough on cells. When ice grows, it can puncture through cells and lyse all these little critters. So ice-binding proteins, right, they bind to those ice crystals, they stop them from growing, and that's a really, really neat adaptation for things that are constantly being freeze-thawed, right, because they stop these ice crystals from bursting through their cells. If those crystals start forming internally and busting through their organs, they can release these IBPs, ice-binding proteins, and again, these ice-binding proteins bind to the ice and they stop them from disrupting, damage to cells and internally as well. So that's a really, really cool adaptation that was discovered, and can have a lot of implications for icy worlds. Most things outside of Earth are very, very icy, right? Mars is a very, very cold planet. Europa, Enceladus, Titan, these are all very, very cold planets. It's very cold once you get outside our little niche. And so having these ice-binding proteins is an adaptation that we could see for life, potentially surviving outside of Earth, right? Other really neat adaptations that we found, so in tardigrades, again, everybody kind of knows these as water bears. Water bears can basically desiccate themselves of all water, and they slow their metabolisms to about 0.1% of their normal metabolism. That's almost no metabolism, right? So they hibernate like little bears. They're like little tiny little bears that hibernate, and they're very, very cute. But they hibernate just like actual bears might hibernate, right? But they also can pop out of all the water out of their bodies and turn into these little dry little balls, and then when the water comes back, they bounce back, right? They bounce back to life, which is absolutely mind-blowing. So a lot of really, really, really cool, neat adaptations that, not only we can, study for, to get a good idea of Earth life, right, and diversity and adaptations, but also things that might be outside of Earth and in these other cold environments, right? I guess the last thing I want to talk about is something that is very prominent on Earth, a bacteria called methanogens, right? So methanogens are super neat. So I've talked a little bit about, what is life. Let's talk about a little bit about what life needs, right? So we know, in terms of life on Earth, right? We know there are three things that life really needs to survive, right? They need basic chemical elements, and they need 6 of these, right? So hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, sulfur, phosphorus, and nitrogen. We've kind of come up with these things that requirements for life as we know it on Earth, right? So requirements for life are 3 things. First is a set of chemical elements. The second is an energy source, and the third is water, right? And so for a long time, right, we knew this energy source as the sun, right? And so this is where you get all these notions, earlier notions of what and where life could exist, right? Life needs light. It doesn't actually. Surprisingly, life needs an energy source. It doesn't necessarily have to be light. So this is where, advancements in the deep sea came, right? For a long time, people thought that there was no life in the deep sea because it needed light. We've shown now that life doesn't need light, but it does need an energy source. Organisms don't necessarily need light. They're chemotrophs, and chemotrophs get their energy from chemical elements, right, that donate electrons. They take these electrons, high energy, and they then put them onto other chemical compounds, right? So we found a whole new world of diversity when we realized that life can use multiple energy sources, right? We don't need the sun, we need an energy source, and chemotrophs can get their energy from chemicals, right? Chemochemical. And so, so what other paradigms do we know that can be broken about life, right? For example, what I study now is Antarctica, right? Is it too cold for life? Probably not. Let's all go, check now all these little places that we thought had no life. We're slowly kind of breaking barriers to finding out, what is really required for life. And
so, do you think that we're gonna find life on Mars? Like, what's?
Yeah. So the cool thing, right? There's been a lot of cool data coming out of all these rover missions to Mars and all the past rover missions to Mars, right? First we found water ice, and that was crucial, right? You remember that there's an image of the rover kind of scooping up the dirt, and then you find ice, and then we're later finding that that ice was water ice. And it's funny because most people think of ice as water ice, but in space, ice is like a whole different set of mixtures, right? You can have carbon monoxide, you can have methane, you can have all these different ice compositions, right? So anyway, all these missions that, they're crucial for finding out about Mars, right? But the one cool fact we found was that, you dig up the ice and it's made out of water, right? So there is water on Mars. There's also an atmosphere of carbon dioxide, right? And I'll tell you why that's important for a minute. So you have water, you have carbon dioxide, and recently they found a flux of methane, right? So methane goes up in the summer, methane goes down in the winter. Methane goes up in the summer, methane goes down in the winter. So why that's really cool is you have these things, you have bacteria on Earth called methanogens. Methanogens use a part of water, hydrogen gas. They take electrons, they get energy from this hydrogen gas, and they deposit that on carbon dioxide to produce methane, right? So you have on Mars, you have H2, which is hydrogen gas, you have carbon dioxide for them to deposit that stuff, and then you have fluctuating methane on a summer cycle, right? So my thoughts, along with a lot of astrobiologists and NASA thoughts, right, is that you have bacteria that are, during the summer when things get a little warmer, they start being active, right? Like most things on Earth, when it heats up and you get a little bit of water, right? You start getting metabolically active, right? So they are getting energy from the hydrogen gas, they are putting it onto the CO2, and you have production of methane, which is very key of methanogens. So if they found life on Mars, my first thought would be methanogens, right, in the soil, or subsurface, sorry. So Mars is also really complex, right, because you're probably not going to find, and for the most part, scientists at NASA have shown that for the most part it's pretty barren on the surface. And why is that? Because of all the radiation going on at the surface, but subsurface, right, and that's typically where methanogens lie on Mars, but subsurface, I think there's a possibility for life in the subsurface. I also think there's a possibility of life in the ice, in the poles, right? So again, with these ice binding proteins, they create habitats. Microorganisms can also, we're talking about, they shoot out these ice binding proteins, they bind and stop ice crystals from forming. Sometimes they can make a little bubble of ice around themselves and they can live in that ice, right? So on Mars, you can have potentially things living in the ice that we don't know about, right? So there are plenty of little niches that life, again, we think of Mars as a dead planet, but, so far with the places on Earth that we thought were completely inhospitable to life, we are finding life. And so, there's a lot of little clues on Mars, and just so everybody knows, with the methane fluctuations, there are a ton of other theories that do not include biological methanogens or organisms, right? It could also be, this is a sad point of life, where you always have to consider the non-biological things. As a biologist, I like the biology. There are plenty of, chemists and non-biological scientists who say, that frozen methane is also on Mars. So in the summer, when methane gas is released, that may contribute to the increase in methane, right? And then you might have a decrease in methane as it gets colder, and then ice melts and releases methane gas, right? So it could also be non-biological, but there are lots of little clues, that point to potentially finding life, little clues from life here on Earth and little clues from the rovers, that, Mars is a really good candidate. Enceladus is one of Saturn's moons that we're really excited about, because we have sent Cassini, which was one of the missions that went there and flew through a plume and discovered everything that was needed for life. So now it's just a question, we discovered everything that's needed for life as we know it on Enceladus. The only thing we haven't found yet is the life. And that's the number one candidate beyond Mars, Europa, and Titan, but Enceladus is also where I'd bet money. So hopefully, soon, keep funding that science, and let's find some, a new genesis of life somewhere.
Nice.
To Antarctica and a couple different places in Antarctica, right? So Antarctica looks like this with a little tail, which is a peninsula. So I've been to that peninsula over austral winter, where it's completely dark for 6 months of the year, right? So we went during the winter, and we looked at how things that need light survive without light for 6 months, right? And then also, as I said, the remote area in the Transantarctic Mountains of the Dry Valleys, which is on eastern Antarctic. Right, and we only go there during the summer because during the winter it's minus 80 degrees. So our life can't really be supported over winter yet, right? But so a lot of places in Antarctica. I've been to the Arctic side of things in Greenland. Greenland though has real bears, not little microscopic bears, but real bears. So I prefer to do all my work where there's less wildlife. Alright guys, thanks. I hope you gained a little bit of knowledge, but I hope you gained a lot more curiosity. So please come talk to me May 1st. Follow the Zoom link and I'll be there to answer questions. Keep on sciencing.
Hey guys, come and talk to Angela on May 1st on our Zoom link. I really hope that you like this video, and stay curious and
keep on sciencing.
keep on sciencing.